Hey there everybody, my name is Kat Bowser. I'm your resident fantasy therapist. Welcome back to my channel. Those of you here for the first time, welcome. My name is Kat Bowser. I'm a licensed therapist. I'm also a writer working on my first two novels, one the start of a series, one a standalone. Now on my channel I like to talk about what I consider to be the heart of all writing, and that's the psychology behind the characters, behind the world, because in my mind that's what makes a world and a character feel real and feel, well, that's what connects me to a story and a character, is the psychology. So that's kind of the angle I like to take when I talk about pretty much anything on my channel. Hey guys, so today I wanted to talk a little bit about creating fear in your story. I've touched on this a little bit in the past because I think fear is a very useful tool for a writer to really dig into their character's psychology, mainly because fear is usually based on a type of loss, and that usually will tell you your character's morals and things like that, what they value. But I want to talk about how do you create fear in a story, because I'm someone, I really like fantasy, but I also like to dabble in horror a little bit. It is something I've started to explore, and I think most fantasy, especially epic fantasy, does have some elements of horror in it. So I wanted to touch on that a little bit. How do you create fear? And I think I want to start with, what don't you do? I think one of the hardest things about a horror novel is, especially if it's a monster novel, like if you've got vampires or a werewolf or, some kind of monster creature, it's very tempting to try and describe this creature as this horrific monstrosity. And don't get me wrong, I mean, a lot of people do that and they do it very well, but I don't think that's an effective way to create fear. Now you might be thinking, what? You're describing this horrific, scary monster. How is that not a good way to create fear? I think it creates some fear, but if you look at things like cosmic horror, like Lovecraft, or even Stephen King's It, which are usually cited as being very frightening, they very rarely give you a detailed description of the monster. And there's a reason for that, because the reader's imagination is going to create something that is 1,000 times scarier than anything you could come up with. Absolutely, because the reader's imagination is inherent to the person. So they're going to conjure up something that is reflective of what their personal fears and doubts and things are. So my version of whatever this thing is going to be different than, say, my sister's or my husband's, because we all have different psychological makeup. And I think that is one advantage when you have a story with some kind of creature or monster, but you don't ever fully, completely describe what it is. Like, I think this is one way that, especially in the movies, the movie versions of It, spoiler alert, I guess, if you guys haven't read the monstrosity of the book or seen the movies. So, at the very end of the story, the monster It takes on essentially what is a giant spider-like form, because it's the closest thing the human mind can conjure up to what this monster is. And most of the time people are kind of disappointed, because if you think about it, not everybody's scared of the same thing. Like for me, I'm not a huge fan of spiders, so the idea of a giant spider, yeah, that's frightening to me. But what makes a spider frightening to me is different than maybe what the director thinks. Like in the new movie, they gave it spider legs but kept the clown upper body. And to me, that just looked weird. It wasn't scary at all. It just looked weird. In the original miniseries, they had a very stop motion-ish spider that wasn't really scary. It looked kind of odd and just kind of out of place. The spider that has scared me is Shelob from Lord of the Rings, because it was a very funnel webbish tarantula looking spider, and I always find those creepy. So that personally was scarier to me, but because like I said, everybody has their own imagination and fears and values and things that influence what is going to scare them. So in my mind, if you can create a story where you don't ever fully describe the character that is the center point of the fear, like the monster or whatever, then don't. Give enough that your reader kind of gets an idea of what you're going for, but leave it to their imagination as much as you can, because I just find that's much more effective. So how do you create fear then? In my opinion, the absolute best way to create fear in a story is to make your character vulnerable. Fear is a very primal emotion. It is essentially there to keep us alive. That is its job. When we were hunters and cavemen and things like that, we would grow afraid of a saber-toothed tiger or whatever because it could eat us. And that tends to keep you from reproducing if you get eaten. So that's fear's job, is to keep you alive. So in order to create a sense of fear, let's remove resources that would help keep your character alive. This could be things like a support group. That's why in a lot of movies and stuff, that's why they do the let's split up horror trope. I don't think you should have your character say, hey, let's split up, gang. But if you can find a way to separate them from the rest of their group, that's a good move, because now it's just them. They don't have any backup. The other thing is, what is their environment and what are your character's strengths? Are they physically strong? Are they mentally strong? Now let's take that away. So how do we do that? Well, let's talk about if you have a character who is mentally strong. How do we confuse them? How do you get it so they are constantly on edge? Because when we're on edge, the part up here, the frontal lobe, where you do a lot of your reasoning and figuring things out, which are what mentally strong people generally do in a crisis, it's much harder to do. So you have made their strength harder to access. Environment can be another thing. If your character has a very horrible sense of balance, let's put them in a rickety kind of setting where they can fall very easily, because this is something they're not good at. I think it's very important to make it individualized to each character. So the way that you scare one character is not going to be the same way you scare the other. And I think that's why when you have a group in a horror setting, it's very important to focus on each character by themselves, because if you focus on them as a group, whatever horror you come up with, it's going to affect some of them, but maybe not the others. And so that's why I think the smaller your group in a horror book, the better. Another thing to take into account, like I said, their physical abilities. What is something you can do to make them feel vulnerable? Anytime you can remove some of the senses, the things that we use to judge and gauge our environment, that tends to put us on edge. But remember, not all your characters are going to have the same sense. I think a lot of times in horror, there's this idea of let's put them in a dark room where they really can't see. And yeah, for most people, we do rely a lot on our sight. But let me give you guys an example. My husband is visually impaired. He is considered legally blind. He can still see, he can still read, but it's much harder for him. However, to make up for that, he has extremely good hearing. So if I was going to put him in a book, because, authors are mean like that, we like to do that. If I was going to put him in a book, I probably wouldn't go with a dark setting for him, because he's not as reliant on his sight as I am. Now me, definitely, throw me in a dark wood or something. Yeah, that would work for me. But for him, I would want to put him somewhere where he can't use his hearing, or he can't use it as well, because that's one of his big strengths, one of his big senses that are a big strength. The other thing is he's a survivalist. He knows wilderness survival, so I'm not going to throw him in a dark forest or anything like that. I am going to throw him maybe somewhere where there's not a lot of resources. Maybe in literally an abandoned house that's made of stone and has nothing lying around that he can utilize, that kind of thing. I think you guys kind of get what I'm saying is you put a character in a situation where they can't utilize their strengths and their weaknesses are brought more to the forefront. That to me is how you really build fear in a character, because you make them vulnerable. We do not like to be vulnerable, because that is not that is not good for survival. When we're vulnerable, that is not a good thing. So to me, that's a good way to introduce a sense of just dread in your story, whether you're writing horror or fantasy or whatever, and you want to introduce a sense of dread. In my mind, that's a really good way to do it. So thank you guys for chiming in for my video. I hope you guys found it interesting. As always, if you have comments or suggestions, feel free to leave them below. I will get to them as soon as I can. If you guys don't want to miss when I upload, make sure you subscribe and ring that bell so that you get notified whenever new videos go up. I try to put up new videos at least twice a week. And until next time, stay safe, take care, and have a good one.